Thanks, and thanks everyone for coming. As I mentioned, this series of meetings was called in response to the New York Times Project 1619. How many are familiar with the Project 1619 or have read it? Do you know about it? Okay, actually that's a bit more than some of the other meetings. We have called it in response to the Project 1619, but the issues which are raised are of a broader character, as I'll seek to discuss in the course of this meeting, and particularly addressing the question of the promotion of racial and identity politics by the Democratic Party and its significance. The title for this meeting actually is Perspectives for the Coming Revolution in America. And before getting to the question of the Project 1619, I want to place it in a certain context. The title begins with the understanding, which I think is broadly felt by workers and young people throughout the world, that we live in a revolutionary period. Leon Trotsky, in his History of the Russian Revolution, wrote that the most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. I think this is the period that we are just entering, but actually are in the midst of. And this is something which is increasingly being recognized by the representatives of the ruling class itself. In a recent commentary published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a leading geostrategic think tank of the American ruling class, an individual by the name of Samuel Brannan, who's the director of the Risk and Foresight Group, defines the present period as what he called the age of leaderless revolution. And he begins by pointing to mass uprisings and protests throughout the world in recent weeks and months in Lebanon, Iraq, Chile, and Spain, and Hong Kong, Ecuador, Honduras, Haiti, Egypt, Algeria, and many other countries. He does not mention, but one should really add, the significant growth of class struggle here in the United States, including the significant strikes by GM auto workers and Chicago teachers over the past month. Polls show, particularly among young people, a sharp shift to the left and growing interest in socialism and hostility to capitalism. Brannan in this article writes, quote, "The world is experiencing the volatility of what my late colleague Zbigniew Brzezinski identified in 2008 as a global political awakening, a sweeping revolution the likes of which we have never before seen." He adds, quote, "The risks and implications are mounting for governments, businesses, and organizations of every type. It is a question of when, not if, the digital flash mob comes for those in power." And of course, he's writing from the standpoint of fear of the consequences of the growing leaderless revolution, as he calls it, the growing wave of mass protests and social unrest throughout the world. It is a question of when and not if the digital flash mob comes for those in power, including here in the United States. This is their fear. But he does define the revolutions as leaderless, and he holds out the hope that they, quote, "can be co-opted for good," by which he means channeled in a way that does not threaten the interests of the ruling elite. Indeed, the question of leadership is the central issue, so long as these mass demonstrations and protests do not have a clear political leadership, that is, a clear understanding of what they are fighting against and what they are fighting for. There's the ever-present danger that they will be co-opted, that they will be smothered, that they will be repressed or channeled behind dead ends. As Trotsky stressed in 1938, quote, "The historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of revolutionary leadership." Building a leadership, developing within the working class an understanding of what it is fighting for and what it is fighting against, is a complicated process. It requires, I think, above all, a protracted struggle against all those who would seek to pollute consciousness, to divert social anger, to co-opt, in the words of Brannan, the opposition of workers and youth. It's within this context that the Socialist Equality Party and the International Youth and Students for Social Equality have decided to hold a series of meetings on the New York Times 1619 project, because we think that understanding and combating the conceptions advanced in this project, which express a broader political conception that is being aggressively promoted, and the Times project itself is being aggressively promoted. It's being distributed free of charge to schools throughout the country. Campuses are urged to create curricula around the historical framework presented by the Times. This is being aggressively promoted, and the fight against the conceptions promoted in the project are of immense importance for the working class and youth. And particularly the development or opposition to the efforts to divert a class struggle. I mean, the issues that are animating the protests and demonstrations throughout the world are essentially of a class character, questions of social inequality, austerity. They're not motivated by issues related to race or nationality or ethnicity. Increasingly, workers and young people feel united throughout the world. The enormous advances in technology have integrated the struggles of workers in a way which was previously unimaginable. And there are every effort in response to that to divide and pit workers against each other. Of course, that takes the form with the Trump administration of the promotion of anti-immigrant chauvinism, outright racism, anti-Semitism, really the most vile political and ideological conceptions of the 20th century are being resurrected in Trump. But the Democrats have a different strategy for the same end, to divide the working class against each other, and their specialty is the promotion of the politics of identity, in particular race and gender identity. And what is involved in the Times Project 1619 is a form of historical revisionism, which is connected to contemporary politics aimed at elevating race in particular as a central social and political category. Indeed, at promoting racial conflicts. At the very point where masses of workers and youth all over the world are entering struggle over issues of class, there's a conscious effort to divide and disorient. I think it's necessary to state at the outset that there is nothing left-wing about the Project 1619. Indeed, it shares more in common, theoretically and politically, with the fascistic reaction of Donald Trump than anything traditionally associated with progressive politics. Now, what is the central argument of the Times Project? The argument is that the central, enduring, and unending problem in the United States is in its history and in its present. The root is the, quote, racism that we cannot purge from this nation to this day, in the words of Nicole Hannah Jones, the lead author in the Times Project. She writes that anti-black racism runs in the very DNA of this country. It is the original sin of American society, and it is endemic. That is, it is a disease embedded in a particular people that has not, and by extension cannot, be purged. It's not just a question of an argument that racism exists. Of course, racism does exist. The argument of the Times is that the conflict between the races is the basic and enduring issue. Where this comes from? Well, it comes from the white people. Nicole Hannah Jones was asked this question at a meeting in New York University yesterday. Where is this racism coming from that is endemic, that is in the DNA? She said, well, I don't know. It's a psychosis. It's simply something that is possessed, inherent in the races themselves, really, this racial conflict. For the Times, the history of the United States is a history of struggle among races, between white people who have benefited from the oppression of black people, first through slavery, then through segregation, and now through white supremacy. History is defined in terms of the conflict between races, with common interests shared by individuals who are categorized by their race. A definite historical falsification is required to force history into this mold. It's not possible in the course of a single meeting to review all of the historical falsifications that flow from this analysis. As I mentioned at the beginning, we published a series of articles, two lectures already on the WSWS that with detailed replies to the Times account of the American Revolution and the Civil War, two monumental events in world history that initiated and completed the bourgeois democratic revolution in America. We've also published 3 very excellent interviews with American historians, James McPherson, James Oakes, and Victoria Bynum, that address these themes. And I would encourage everyone to read those interviews. One element, though, of the Times' attitude toward these revolutions that I think is important to underscore in relationship to the themes of this lecture is that the hostility that this is a hostility that this interpretation of history displays toward the Enlightenment, that is, the intellectual and political revolution in thought which arose out of the immense advances in science in the 16th and 17th century, which emphasized the ability of humans to understand the world and through reason reconstruct it on rational foundations. Now, hostility to the Enlightenment is traditionally the purview of the far right. There's a whole tradition of political intellectual thought, the counter-Enlightenment, which was the reaction. It was the reaction against the egalitarian, rationalistic, scientific conceptions which were advanced in the Enlightenment. And the figures most closely associated, I think, with Enlightenment thought in the history of American bourgeois politics, Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln. And those are in particular the figures which are most directly targeted in the Times 1619 project. There's a book which came out a few years ago, which clearly is a major influence in the Times 1619 project. It's by Ibram Kendi, stamped from the beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. Kendi is a professor of history and international relations at the American University, and he's a founding director of the so-called Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. He's also published a recent book, which came out a couple months ago, called How to Be an Anti-Racist, I believe. But many of the themes which are present in the 1619 essays are developed in Kendi's book on the history of racist ideas in America. And he begins with a chapter on the Enlightenment in which he makes this statement. He says that the Enlightenment was really a metaphor for Europeanness and therefore whiteness. Enlightenment ideas gave legitimacy to this long-held racist partiality, the connection between lightness and whiteness and reason on the one hand, and between darkness and blackness and ignorance on the other. That is, the Enlightenment was, and the theoretical political conceptions behind the American Revolution, the Great Revolutionary Uprising, the French Revolution as well, was really simply a stand-in for white racism. As I indicated, the hostility to the Enlightenment is a provenance of the far right, not the left, but is connected to a contempt for rationality and for democratic principles that characterize the modern pseudo-left, a theme to which I will return later in this lecture. So the historical presentation in the Times account, and in Kendi's book as well, is that the history of the United States is the history of the conflict between the races. To carry forward this narrative into the latter portion of the 19th century and into the 20th century requires that the Times completely ignore and cover up the profound social and political developments that transformed the freed slaves into a critical section of the working class. It is in fact necessary to wash away completely the history of the class struggle. In fact, therefore, the history of the African American working class.
Did you lower the lights so we can also see the screen?
Yeah, well, we tried that earlier and it didn't work. Everything that's on the screen I'll read. That's why you have to get here at the beginning. In the Times account, there is simply, in fact, no working class. The word class does not make a single appearance in the entire introductory historical essay by Hannah Jones. Not once. The term white Americans appears 15 times, white people 19 times, black Americans 28 times, black people 43 times, yet working class appears 0 times. And this is a reflection of the conceptions which the Times is utilizing. What exists are races, not classes, races. If one were to base a curriculum on the Times account, as schools and colleges throughout the country are being urged to do, this new narrative of American history would remove all reference to the insurrectionary and violent class battles that have characterized American capitalism since it first emerged fully in the decades following the Civil War. I think the purpose is as much to cut workers and youth off from this history of class struggle as it is about establishing an alternative narrative of enduring and unending racial conflict. Or really the two are two sides of the same aim. Absent from the Times account is any mention of the populist movement in the South, which sought in the decades after the Civil War to unite freed blacks and poor whites, In fact, therefore, the Times cannot provide any serious account of the origins of Jim Crow segregation and the KKK, except to explain it as the outcome of the inherent racism of white people. In fact, Jim Crow segregation, the KKK, which became the militant arm of the reactionaries in the Democratic Party at that time in the South, was the conscious response of the ruling class to the threat of an alliance between blacks and poor whites. There is no mention in the Times account of Tom Watson, the leader of the populist movement, who early in his career addressed his appeal to both races. He said in one appeal, "You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arc of financial despotism which enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a monetary system that beggars you both." The historian of the South, C. Van Woodward, in his very important book, The Strange Career of Jim Crow, which everyone who really wants to understand the origins and development of racism really has to read, noted that the emergence of racism, the emergence of the populist movement demonstrated that the policies of segregation and racism were not a product of what he called the immutable folkways of the South. And he said that the belief that they are immutable and unchangeable is not supported by history. That is, of course, this is precisely the argument of the Times, that the racism is the product of the immutable folkways of the South or the immutable ways of white people. And his argument in analyzing the development of the populist movement and the response of the ruling class to it was that this was not something embedded in white people. It was not a psychosis that arose out of the white race, that it was a product of class interests. He talks about, in fact, not only the role of, or the connection of the emergence of Jim Crow to the need to divide poor whites and poor blacks, but also its connection to the emergence of American imperialism, beginning with the Spanish-American War of 1898. He makes the point, in fact, that it was during this period that the United States was bringing into its domain millions of individuals in Asia and as well as in the Caribbean, and that it revived an interest in racist ideas, including among liberals. He cites an article in The Nation, the same nation which exists today as the arm of the Democratic Party, talking about the inferior races who were being brought into the American empire, who of course should not be allowed to vote. And American imperialism, as it emerged and conquered new territories, encouraged within the ruling classes the racist conceptions which then were associated with Jim Crow segregation. Of course, none of this finds its way into the pages of the New York Times account. To acknowledge any of the monumental class struggles that emerged in the aftermath of the Civil War, beginning with the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and continuing through the sit-down strikes and general strikes of the 1930s, would require that the Times acknowledge that the fight against social inequality and the fight against racism became centered in the struggle to unify the working class against the corporations and the capitalist system. The Times makes no mention of the Industrial Workers of the World, which was established in 1905 and organized a series of militant industrial struggles and strikes in the early part of the 20th century. At a founding Congress of the IWW in June of 1905, Big Bill Haywood, there on the left, called the organization of the IWW, in a historic reference to the American Revolution, the Continental Congress of the Working Class. The American Federation of Labor, Haywood declared, which presumes to be the labor movement of this country, is not a working class movement. It does not represent the working class. There are organizations that are affiliated, but loosely affiliated with the AFL, which in their constitution and bylaws prohibit the initiation or conferring the obligation on a colored man. That is, that they cannot be in the union. They prohibit the conferring of the obligation on foreigners. What we want to establish at this time is a labor organization that will open wide its doors to every man that earns his livelihood either by his brain or his muscle. The Times makes no mention of the founding of the Socialist Party of America in 1901. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs declared in 1903, "I have said and say again that properly speaking, there is no Negro question outside of the labor question, the working class struggle. Our position as socialists and as a party is perfectly plain. We simply say the class struggle is colorless. The capitalist, white, black, and other shades are on the one side, and the workers, white, black, and all other colors are on the other side." Nowhere in the Times revision of American history is there room for a discussion of the great migration of African American workers to the North, the emergence of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and the monumental class battles of the 1930s and 1940s, which required, in fact, a fight to unify the working class against the efforts of the ruling class, including fascists like Henry Ford, to divide them along racial and ethnic lines. And of course, there is no room for the worldwide impact of the Russian Revolution, which inspired millions of workers with its call for the unity of the entire working class of every race and nationality in the struggle against capitalist oppression and imperialist war. Now, none of this can be mentioned because it cuts across the claim that the United States is riven by irreconcilable racial antagonisms, that the workers who are right are irredeemably racist. To understand, I think, the origins and political function of the conceptions promoted by the Times, it is necessary to understand the way in which the ruling class, in particular the Democratic Party, responded to the threat of social revolution that emerged in the 20th century. In the 1930s, with the example of the Russian Revolution fresh in their minds and amidst growing working class insurgency within the United States, which many interpreted correctly to indicate the danger of revolution in America. In response to that, American liberalism under the Democratic Party administration of Franklin Roosevelt fashioned the New Deal, a reform agenda that implemented restraints on the power of big business and significant redistribution of income. As Trotsky explained at the time, America's wealth permits Roosevelt his experiments. Already, however, by the 1940s, under the impact of the Second World War, liberalism has begun to shift. Alan Brinkley, in his book The End of Reform, notes that by 1945, even, the policies of the Democratic Party had begun to move, quote, from a preoccupation with reform, with a set of essentially class-based issues centered around confronting the problem of monopoly and economic disorder, and toward a preoccupation with rights, a commitment to the liberties and entitlements of individuals and thus to the liberation of oppressed peoples and groups. Brinkley writes, rights-based liberalism was in some respect part of a retreat from a broad range of economic issues involving the structure of the industrial economy and the distribution of wealth and power within it, end quote. However, even while this shift had already begun by the mid-40s, even in the aftermath of the Second World War, the ruling class still maintained significant redistributive measures, including high taxes on the wealthy. The top marginal tax rate for the wealthiest Americans under Truman and Eisenhower was 90%. Today, I think it's 35%, and effectively much lower, 15%. In 1964, LBJ announced the fight against poverty, which he said would prove the success of our system, that is, the capitalist system, which was followed by the introduction of Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps. However, this in fact proved to be the last gasp of American liberalism. By the late 1960s, the post-war boom began to unravel, and the policies of the Democratic Party and the ruling class as a whole underwent a further lurch to the right. The Great Society and the War on Poverty, announced by LBJ, were shipwrecked by the Vietnam War and the protracted decline in the global position of American capitalism. The period of significant social reform, of any social reform, proved in fact to be very short-lived. The move toward a policy of social counter-revolution, of wiping out all the gains that workers had won through bitter struggles in the previous decades, coincided with a deliberate strategy aimed at elevating sections of the middle class, particularly of minority populations, into the institutions of class rule. And I think this is really the critical episode to understand in terms of the emergence of modern-day identity politics, this period between the mid-1960s and the 1970s. And this is a period that encompassed a massive wave of social unrest, not only in the United States, but internationally. Of course, it was a period of the May-June strikes in 1968 in France, massive social upheavals all over the world. In the United States, it was a period of the civil rights movement, which itself was part of a broader wave of social unrest, major strike action by the working class, the Vietnam anti-war protest movement, the uprisings in major cities throughout the United States. And it was a period of a shift in ruling class policy, because the ruling class responded to this wave of social unrest by moving sharply to the right and beginning a period which was initiated particularly by the end of the 1970s, although it was begun earlier, of social counter-revolution. So I think this period is critical to understand in terms of the emergence of modern-day identity politics, and what really the shift between the civil rights movement and identity politics. It is a extraordinary fact that in the entire New York Times magazine, the name this is supposedly dedicated to the history of race relations in the United States. The name Martin Luther King appears only once, and that is a caption to a photograph. And in Hannah Jones' article, it does not appear at all. And I think and also Malcolm X and any of the leaders of the civil rights movement. I think that's not, or that this is for good reason. In fact, King's own writings during this period are themselves a refutation of the racialist narrative of the times, which places all white Americans and white people on the side of racist reaction and bigotry, the psychosis of the white people, in the words of Hannah Jones, benefiting and supporting the lynching of blacks. I just want to cite a couple passages from some of the writings and speeches of King, which I think are worth really reading in light of the conceptions that are being now promoted. In a speech in 1961 before a convention of the AFL-CIO, King attacked those who insist on the intrinsic differences between the races. He said, "There is no intrinsic difference, as I have tried to demonstrate. Differences have been contrived by outsiders who seek to impose disunity by dividing brothers because the color of their skin has a different shade." Writing in 1964, King noted that a majority of whites, in fact, throughout the country supported voting rights, housing, and integrated schools and restaurants. This is, again, contrary to the line of the New York Times, which presents all of white people as benefiting and supporting segregation. He noted that, in fact, the majority supported the essential demands of the civil rights movement. He proposed in 1964, that same year, a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged. He argued, quote, "The moral justification for special measures for Negroes is rooted in the robberies inherent in the institution of slavery. Many poor whites, however, were the derivative victims of slavery." Again, contrary to the line of the New York Times, which argues that all white people benefited from the institution of slavery. He says, "Many poor whites were the derivative victims of slavery. As long as labor was cheapened by the involuntary servitude of the black man, the freedom of white labor, especially in the South, was little more than a myth. To this day, the white poor also suffer the deprivation and the humiliation of poverty, if not of color. They are chained by the weight of discrimination, though its badge of degradation does not mark them." One cannot imagine the writers of the Times making such statements today. Their line is that all white people are racist, that they benefited from segregation and slavery. Indeed, the Poor People's Campaign of 1968, initiated by King, specifically targeted white workers in the South and in Appalachia. At the same time, King was coming out ever more forcefully in opposition to the Vietnam War. This was in 1968. He was assassinated on April 4th of that year. Now, King was a social democrat and not a Marxist. He expressed the view that guaranteed employment and basic social rights for all workers, regardless of race, was possible in what he called the richest nation on earth, through capitalist reforms. By the late 1960s, however, the relative position of American capitalism had already begun its protracted decline. 3 years after King's assassination, the Nixon administration ended dollar-gold convertibility, the cornerstone of the Bretton Woods system that had been set up after the Second World War. As the ruling class shifted to the offensive, beginning the process of tearing up all the gains that workers had won, It, as I said, very consciously adopted a policy of integrating and elevating a privileged section of the upper middle class, including of racial minorities, into positions of power. Now, this policy was announced by none other than Richard Nixon, hardly the great proponent of liberalism associated with left-wing politics, but he was really the initiator and the first promoter of affirmative action policies. He declared in 1968, the same year that King was assassinated, in response to the urban rebellions that were occurring throughout the United States during that period, he said, "Black Americans, no more than white Americans, do not want more government programs. They want the pride and the self-respect and the dignity that can only come if they have an equal chance to own their own homes, to own their own businesses, to be managers and executives as well as workers, to have a piece of the action in the exciting ventures of private enterprise." That was a speech by Nixon accepting the Republican Party nomination on August 8, 1968. The New York Times, expressing the consensus that was developing within the ruling class, declared that Nixon's position on the need for the development of black capitalism and ownership in the ghetto could prove to be the most constructive, could prove to be more constructive than anything yet said by other presidential candidates on the crisis of the cities. Thus began the policies of affirmative action and racial quotas, of the promotion of a layer of black businessmen and politicians to preside over an immense increase of social inequality. Nixon himself expressed the view that, quote, "We sooner or later must bring those who threaten domestic peace back within the system," end quote. He established through an executive order the Office of Minority Business Enterprise for this purpose. Over the next several years, a layer of the black middle class was brought into positions of political power as well, including Coleman Young, who became mayor of Detroit in 1974, and over the next 20 years oversaw a massive deindustrialization of the city and the devastation of the living conditions of the vast majority of African Americans, which continues to this day. A decade after Nixon's election in 1968, the Supreme Court upheld affirmative action policies for the first time in the case of the University of California versus Bakke. In his own decision in that ruling, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall stated, I think fairly clearly, the essential purpose of these policies. He said, "It is because of a legacy of unequal treatment that we must now permit the institutions of this society to give consideration to race in making decisions about who will hold positions of influence, affluence, and prestige in America. That is not social equality, not the uplifting of all the poor and oppressed, but the equal distribution of positions of power and affluence," as he put it, "among races and minority groups. Not as a program to uplift all poor people, but the selective elevation of a small minority to preside over deindustrialization and the destruction of the living conditions of the vast majority." Now, this was, I think it's important to note, in fact, an international phenomenon. The shift that was taking place in the United States and the policy of the ruling class towards social counter-revolution was itself an international phenomenon. And the use of identity politics and different forms of affirmative action measures was a common response among ruling elites internationally. I can't go into this in detail, but I just wanted to note the following analysis of affirmative action measures in the U.S., India, and South Africa by University of Michigan economist Thomas Weisskopf, who noted, quote, "The most important purpose that can be served by ethnicity-based positive discrimination in admissions to higher educational institutions is not to redistribute educational opportunities from the rich to the poor. Instead, it is to reduce identity-based differentials in access to the upper strata of society. That is, to integrate the societal elite." Already by the late 1970s, the impact of these and other measures adopted by the ruling class had produced a significant growth of social inequality among African Americans. Black sociologist William Julius Wilson pointed out as early as 1978, that is the same year as the Bakke decision, and only a decade after the assassination of King, pointed to the development, quote, of a deepening economic schism in the black community, with poor blacks falling further and further behind middle and upper income blacks. Class, he said, has become more important than race in determining black life chances. I think it's worth pointing out that such conceptions continue to be at the center of Democratic Party politics today. Democratic Party candidate Cory Booker put it bluntly in an interview with Democracy Now! Just last week. He was responding to discussion over social inequality and the wealth gap. And he said, a lot of people want to talk about the wealth gap, the wealth gap, the wealth gap. And he said, look, there are a lot of people in my community, talking about African Americans in his community, that want to be entrepreneurs, that want to be millionaires. And so I always talk about the wealth gap, yes, but what we really need to talk about is the opportunity gap, and to make sure that everybody has equal opportunity to start a business, to be innovators, to participate in the new job booms of the future and the new businesses of the future. We're not talking about social equality. We're not talking about uplifting or addressing the social catastrophe facing the working class as a whole, but of uplifting a very small layer and providing equal opportunity to the positions of affluence and wealth above all. The shift in ruling class policy coincided with and was integral to a rightward movement within the sections of the upper middle class of all races. And I think it's important to stress that the promotion of the politics based on racial and gender identity became the hallmark of pseudo-left and ex-Marxist intellectuals whose response to the wave of social upheavals and class struggles between 1968 and 1975 was to repudiate any association with working class politics. And many of the conceptions that are now being advanced by the New York Times, the leading publication of the ruling class, really actually cultivated and developed within and among those who were breaking with Marxism fully and completely during this period, between the late 60s and the 1970s. The origins of many of the theories and disciplines very popular on campuses throughout the country today, such as intersectionality theory, critical race theory, identity politics, of course, whiteness studies, and associated schools they have their roots in conceptions that were being developed among ex-Marxists during this period. And I want to just cite a couple examples. The first use of the term identity politics comes from the statement of the so-called Combahee River Collective, a black lesbian feminist organization formed in 1974 by Barbara Smith, Demita Frazier, and Beverly Smith. The organization's statement, published in April 1977, a year before the Bakke decision, claimed to be in fact an extension of Marxist theory, but was in fact a direct repudiation of all its fundamental conceptions. Now to this day, I don't know, has anyone heard of the Combahee River Collective statement? It's very popular among organizations of the pseudo-left. In 2017, it was a centerpiece of a book published by Keeanga Yamada Taylor, a tenured professor at Princeton University, who was at that point a leading member of the International Socialist Organization. The book was called How We Get Free. It's cited by the Democratic Socialists of America, the various caucuses within the DSA that are centered on issues of race and gender. And I think it's worth examining the conceptions that were being developed by this organization. The purpose of the collective, the authors wrote, again, this is 1977, amidst these changes in the ideology and politics of the ruling class. The purpose of the collective, the authors wrote, was to develop, quote, an integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking, or in the modern terminology, intersecting. The most significant oppressions, however, were those based upon race and gender. They wrote, black women's extremely negative relationship to the American political system, a system of white male rule, not a system of class rule, not a system of the rule of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie, of white male rule. The relationship to the American political system has always been determined by our membership in two oppressed racial and sexual castes. Black women have always embodied, if only in their physical manifestation, an adversary stance to white male rule. Underscoring the self-obsessed character of the new politics of the upper middle class, the authors wrote, quote, the focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics comes directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression. That is, the aim was not social equality and the liberation of all mankind, the aim of the socialist movement, but personal advancement, leveraging various categories of identity to achieve positions of power and privilege. I think there is an analogy to the social motivations behind the rise of the Stalinist bureaucracy and its attacks on the program and perspective of permanent revolution. Trotsky said of the thinking of the petty Soviet official, "Not everything for the world revolution, something for me too." The Combahee statement concludes with the following, which I think sums up his attitude not simply to white workers, but to the working class as a whole. In her introduction to Sisterhood is Powerful, Robin Morgan writes, "I haven't the faintest notion what possible revolutionary role white heterosexual men could fulfill, since they are the very embodiment of reactionary vested interest power." It doesn't go, actually, Robin Morgan in this introduction to her book goes on to suggest that men should simply disappear, that it would be better if they didn't exist, because they are the embodiment of reaction. Poor whites, and particularly white men, are categorized under the general heading of white male rule. White people, irretrievably racist, are the embodiment of reactionary vested interest power. Now consider the period in which this was being written. The Combahee Collective was formed in 1974, the year of the largest strike movement in the United States since the 1950s, including a 28-day strike of coal miners in West Virginia and other states. The statement was written less than 1 year before the 1977-78 coal miners' strike, waged in defiance of the invocation of Taft-Hartley by the Democratic Party administration of Jimmy Carter. The hundreds of thousands, millions of workers involved in these struggles, and many others were perhaps in their majority white men, or at least a very significant proportion of them were white men. Were they not then the part of reactionary vested interest power? Was their effort to maintain their jobs and living conditions an expression of a longing for white privilege? This is really the consequences of the rejection of a politics based upon class. And this was, in fact, an international phenomenon. The rejection of class-based politics, and with it an ever more direct opposition among sections of the so-called left to the theoretical conceptions of Marxism. The rise to prominence of figures like Michel Foucault in France, a major inspiration for intersectionality and critical race theory, was part of a broader turn away from Marxism. Foucault, a pupil of Stalinist Louis Althusser, and once himself a member of the French Communist Party, developed in the 1960s and 1970s, the same period that we're considering in relationship to the United States, a theoretical framework that rejected the primacy of class conflict in favor of what he called the multiplicity of force relations immanent in the sphere in which they operate. Foucault's philosophy was based on the rejection of the notion of objective truth that existed outside of language and discourse. Truth and power are constructed through language, through ideas, rather than existing in the material class relations of production. Ideas including racist ideas. Force relations, and the racist ideas are themselves bound up with language. There's no class basis for an analysis of racism. This comes from language, from ideas. Force relations based on race or other categories conditioned by thought are no less fundamental, according to Foucault. Indeed, they are more fundamental than the exploitation inherent in the capitalist system, which in any case can't be said to exist outside of language and discourse. Talk of the objective interests of the working class of all races and nationalities is something that he considered invalid, since there is in fact no objective social relations outside of their construction through language. Such conceptions were part of a broader rejection of a politics rooted in class, the development of postmodernism, post-structuralism, whole schools of philosophy in France and internationally based upon a rejection of Marxism and a rejection of class politics. To the extent that socialism meant anything, it was to be divorced from the class struggle, from the interests of the working class. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, in their influential 1985 book Hegemony and Socialist Strategy, wrote that what is now in crisis is a whole conception of socialism which rests upon the ontological centrality of the working class, upon the role of revolution with a capital R as the founding moment in the transition from one society to another. I think the most important point, that what is now in crisis is the whole conception of socialism which rests upon the ontological centrality, that is the objective existence of the working class as the revolutionary force. The foundation of Marxism, class politics, that was being thrown out the window in favor of all sorts of other types of politics. Now, this book, and in particular Chantal Mouffe, has been very influential in the rise of political movements in Europe today, including Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain. Syriza has been in power in Greece for several years, implementing the austerity measures of the European banks as well as the anti-immigrant policies of the European Union. And Podemos has just agreed to join the bourgeois government in Spain and take up its own role in the implementation of reactionary measures in the interests of the ruling class. The theoretical conceptions developed by the new proponents of racial and gender politics became anchored in definite social interests, the interests of privileged layer of the upper middle class, including but not limited to professors that populate the humanities departments of the major universities, where anti-Marxism has become a requirement of the profession. The past 4 decades have seen, of course, a massive redistribution of wealth from the working class to the rich. And this is, of course, we know that the top 1%, and the fact that over the past several decades, the share of the national income going to the top 1% has risen from 12% to 20%, a massive growth in the wealth of the top 1%. Meanwhile, the share of the bottom 50% has declined from 20 to 12%. I think, however, a less broadly recognized but very important phenomenon is not just the increase in the wealth in the top 1%, but also the increase in the wealth of the upper middle class, the next 9%. That is, those who are in the top 10%, but not in the top 1%, those who are earning perhaps more than $150,000 a year. The perpetual rise in the stock markets and the intensification in the exploitation of the working class has benefited more than just the super rich. A layer of the upper middle class has also benefited. This layer with incomes over $150,000 a year has seen its share of national income increase from 23% in 1970 to nearly 28% today. So it also has benefited, perhaps not as much as the top 1%, but those with enough money to be able to invest in the stock market are able to see a very significant increase in their standard of living. And of course, the ever unending increase in the stock market is bound up with the increase in the exploitation of the working class, as well as the operations of American imperialism internationally. The growth of inequality within minority populations is particularly significant. The richest 10% of African Americans now own 75.3% of the wealth owned by all African Americans, and the top 1% owns 40.5% of that wealth. The bottom 60% combined have zero net wealth. And I'll just demonstrate this with these graphs. I don't have a pointer, but the next 2 graphs document this. This is a graph of the percent of each race's wealth held by the top 1%. So if you aggregated all the wealth held by African Americans, all the wealth held by Latinos, all the wealth held by whites, and then you ask, well, what percent of each race, percentage of that wealth of each race is owned by the top 1%? This is the graph. So the red line shows is for whites. It shows the percent of wealth held by all whites, which is held by the top 1%. Is that clear? What this is showing? And it's between 1990 and 2015. So that's the red line, and it shows its increase from a bit under 30% to to 36.5%. A significant increase in the share of overall wealth of whites, which is held by the top 1%. The gray line here is, I'm not sure if you can see the distinguish it. The gray line is one that dips down below there. That's Latinos. It shows an increase of just under 30% as well. Actually, for the most part, all just under 30% in 1990. And that's increased now to 44.7%. and blacks is the black line here. That actually over the past decade in particular has soared enormously. Now the share held by top 1% of blacks, actually it goes up here, is now 40.5%. That is, of all wealth held by blacks, the top 1% owns 40.5% of it. In fact, the inequality, therefore, among blacks is in essence higher than among whites. There's been an enormous increase of social inequality. This shows similar figures in bar graph form, but this is the black wealth share by black wealth decile. So it shows this is the top 10% here on the right, and then the next 10%, the next 10% down to the bottom 10%. And what this shows is that more or less the bottom 60% of African Americans have in aggregate zero net wealth. The bottom 10% has negative 3.3% of the wealth. That is, they in fact have negative wealth. They own more than the wealth that they possess. That's true, by the way, of the bottom of all workers have negative wealth. But really, if you go up to even the bottom 60% of the population, they have on aggregate zero wealth among African Americans. And it's only when you get up to the top 20%, but really the top 10%, that you begin to see a significant amount of wealth possessed. And it's an indication of the massive levels of social inequality that prevail. And of course, this is not a question of race. It's really a broader social development in the country as a whole, which has affected all races. Although I think the policies of racial identity have had a particular impact, and it was designed for this, as they said, to increase the access to positions of affluence within American society. That's the impact that these policies have had, while the conditions of the vast majority have suffered a disastrous decline. Toward the end of her essay, Hannah Jones declares that over the past half century, quote, "Black Americans have made astounding progress, not only for ourselves, but also for all Americans." Well, what does she mean by progress? What progress really has been had? The vast majority of black Americans, as with the vast majority of the working class as a whole, have seen a historic retrogression in their conditions of life. Now, a small section, however, have made significant progress. The conditions of life for the black elite have risen to levels that massively eclipse those that prevailed in the 1970s. The outlook of the black bourgeoisie, there was a famous book written in the 1950s by a black sociologist called The Black Bourgeoisie, which drew attention to the role of the sections. But at that time, the wealth possessed was far, that couldn't really be compared to what exists today, the level of inequality. But the outlook of this layer is expressed by figures like Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose "We Were 8 Years in Power" is a celebration of the Obama administration, which oversaw the largest transfer of wealth from the working class of all races to the rich in American history through the bailout of the banks. The politics of racial, gender, and other forms of identity is the politics of the upper middle class, of all races and genders. It is a mechanism for dividing the working class, subordinating it to the right-wing pro-war politics of the Democratic Party, and a mechanism for carrying out as well bitter struggles within the top 10% for access to positions in academia, corporate boardrooms, and the state. And this layer has moved very sharply to the right. And I think I want to conclude by making the point that there is, again, nothing left-wing about this type of politics. I think that's really critical to understand and to combat. The racial politics promoted by the Times is entirely compatible with the overall line of the Democratic Party, which in its conflict with the Trump administration is seeking to subordinate all opposition to Trump to the CIA and to the military. What is the line that the Democratic Party is advancing in relationship to Trump? Not the fascistic policies that he's carrying out, not that his chief advisor is an out-and-out Nazi, Stephen Miller, has been revealed by recent emails. That's not what they're talking about in these impeachment hearings. They're talking about Trump was not sufficiently subordinating his foreign policy to the demands of the anti-Russia campaign. That's the line of the Democratic Party, uplifting reactionaries and warmongers like John McCain as the paragons of American democracy. It's entirely compatible with the politics which is being promoted in the Project 1619. And this is really, the politics of racial division, of racial history, is the politics of the right. The irrationalist, anti-Enlightenment, anti-Marxist, and anti-working class perspective developed over the past half century has brought the pseudo-left into increasing alignment in its theoretical conceptions and its social outlook with the far right. The obsession with race, the interpretation of history in terms of the conflict of races, the categorization of society into white America and black America, white people and black people with distinct interests. This is not the language of the left, of progressive social reform even, let alone socialist revolution. Indeed, it was a French aristocrat, Arthur de Gobineau, who exercised enormous influence on Hitler and the Nazi ideologists, who most consistently developed in the mid-19th century the racialist theory of history. The historian Richard Wolin, in a book analyzing the postmodernist intellectual romance with fascism, as he calls it, notes that, quote, Gobineau's ingenious strategy was to reestablish the counter-Enlightenment worldview of pseudoscientific foundations by employing the concept of race as a universal key to historical development. Racially based taxonomies of human types were already widely used by anthropologists and natural historians, but Gobineau was the first to apply race systematically to the study of history as a type of hidden master code. And what is the Times Project 1619 if not an effort to, quote, apply race systematically to the study of history? Wolin also notes that the theoreticians of the New Right in France have adopted themselves to the language and style of the pseudo-left. The New Right in France, he writes, quote, has shifted its emphasis from the concept of race to that of culture. Abandoning outmoded arguments for biological racism, it moved in the direction of what may be called a cultural racism. He continues, quote, sounding like a liberal's liberal, New Right theorist de Benoit in France embraced what might be described as a non-hierarchical differentialist racism. No culture was intrinsically better than any other. Instead, they were all different, and these differences should be respected and preserved. Practically speaking, this meant that the place where Algerians should enjoy civil liberties was Algeria, France for the French, an old racist slogan during the Dreyfus Affair, Europe for the Europeans, and so on. As de Benoit explained in the early 1980s, the truth is that the people must preserve and cultivate their differences. Immigration merits condemnation because it strikes a blow to the identity of the host culture as well as the immigrant's identity. Now, what separates such conceptions from those of Stacey Abrams, a rising star in the Democratic Party, who in a defense of identity politics published in Foreign Affairs earlier this year said that racial groups have intrinsic differences, a concept which is entirely antithetical, by the way, to the conception promoted by King that I quoted earlier. Intrinsic differences between the races. Of course, this is not to say that the Democratic Party is a fascistic organization. However, ideas have consequences, or rather political ideas reflect the movement of social forces, and the social forces behind the politics of racial division are right-wing. The insistence on the unbridgeable chasm between blacks and whites does not reflect reality, or for that matter, between all nations and races. While racism certainly exists, attitudes towards race have been transformed enormously over the past half century. Globalization has integrated the working class of the entire world into a single process of production. The masses of workers, as I indicated at the beginning of this lecture, who are being driven into struggle throughout the world are not motivated by issues centered on race or gender or age or sexual orientation or any other identity, but by issues of class. The world situation now, I think, is fraught with immense danger, but also with immense possibilities. The Trump administration, of course, is part of the rise of far-right and fascistic forces throughout the world. In the face of growing social unrest, the ruling elites are resorting to ever more openly to authoritarian forms of rule, resurrecting all the political filth of the 20th century. Geopolitical antagonisms are mounting, and the ruling elites of all the major capitalist countries are remilitarizing in preparation for world war. Another social force, however, is emerging, the working class. In the fight against social inequality, war, and authoritarianism, the working class and youth cannot allow itself to be subordinated to any faction of the ruling elite. It cannot allow itself to be divided along national or racial lines. It must reject the chauvinism of Trump as well as the racial politics of the Democrats. The working class has to advance its own independent response to the crisis of capitalism, one which insists that the right to a job, to health care, to public education, to a livable income, secure requirement, these are rights which must be guaranteed to the entire working class, to all workers, regardless of race and gender, nationality, which insists that the fight against war and authoritarianism, the fight against the return of fascism, is a fight against capitalism and for socialism. And this requires not the redistribution of wealth within the top 10%, not the elevation into positions of affluence in the corporate and financial elite of a small section of the population, but a massive frontal attack on the wealth and privileges of the entire corporate and financial elite, a massive redistribution of wealth, and the transformation of the giant banks and corporations into public utilities in the United States and internationally, run on the basis of social need and not private profit. That is, against the proponents of racial conflict and division, the working class must respond with methods of class war and socialist revolution.